day, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, our voice run. Round with the traitor, up with the sun, for we rally round.
The Congress of the United States is the most powerful lawmaking body in the world. In the brilliant design of the American system of government, the greatest number of powers are given to Congress. Most of those powers are enumerated in Article 1, Section 8 of this great document, the Constitution of the United States. Between the two chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate, the most powerful is the House of Representatives. That is because they control the money. It has the power to tax and the power to spend. All spending bills must originate in that chamber. Yes, the design of the American system is brilliant. Those who designed it understood a great deal about human nature and the flaws inherent in human character. Those men who met in Philadelphia in 1787 drafted a constitution that would control as much as possible man's natural tendency to take unfair advantage of others when vested with a little authority. During that 4-month-long convention, the framers of our Constitution kept one fact of life clearly in mind. Mortal men cannot be trusted with total government power. If power is the corrupting element in man's relation to man, then how could a just government ever be established? How could men be trusted to govern and not abuse that authority, not oppress the people, not plunder them, and not ultimately enslave them? The answer has been thoughtfully and simply given. 1. Limit their power by contract, that is, by a written constitution, and require them to swear to uphold it. 2. Publish a record of their official activities for everyone to see, mainly the people who elect them. 3. Send them home to frequent elections, either to be reappointed or retired, depending upon their performance. All three of these wise restraints are embodied in the Constitution and are intended to keep our elected officials from exceeding the limits of their authority. James Madison, one of the foremost authors of the Constitution, explained a very interesting relationship between power and time in office. He said that it had been a long-standing maxim that the more powerful the office, the more frequent should be the elections. That principle helps explain a great deal about the powers granted to each branch in the original design of our government. Members of the House, being limited to short 2-year terms, have the greatest power. The President, with his 4-year terms, is granted the second greatest power. Ranking third in power is the Senate, where its members are appointed for 6-year terms. And the least powerful of all branches, according to Madison, is the Supreme Court, with its members holding lifetime tenure. But even then, justices of the High Court could, for malfeasance, be removed from office. Much could be said about the usurpations of the Supreme Court, the incredible excesses of the President, and the power abuses of Congress. But for this discussion, let us first focus on the original design of our system. Then we can more clearly assess what's going on in this mad rush for major changes in our Constitution. First, it was to be a government of very limited powers. It was to be a republic, a government not run by the rule of man, but by the rule of law. That basic law of the land would be contained in a written constitution. As Thomas Jefferson said, it would bind men down from mischief, restrict them to certain spheres of activity, and prohibit them from doing anything not allowed under the Constitution. Secondly, the Constitution would diffuse governing powers. It would identify the powers essential to an orderly government and assign those powers to separate and distinct departments that could not, unless otherwise stated in the Constitution, overlap each other. In other words, it was planned so that all powers and cares of government could never be concentrated in a single person or in a single department. Third, there would be 2 levels of government, state, and national. Each government would have its own area of jurisdiction. The national government would take care of national defense, foreign affairs, and other federal matters, while each state would administer all other affairs germane to its own circumstances. The uniting of individual states to form a single nation is what we call federalism. Nothing like this had ever been attempted in the history of human governance. Federalism, much to the chagrin of America's critics, has worked remarkably well. The people have granted, through the Constitution, specific powers to the federal government. All other powers are retained by the people, with the exception of those powers that have been delegated to the states. The vast number of rights and powers enjoyed by the people in America have never been yielded to any government and are therefore retained by the people. These are the bare essentials of our Republican system of government, and I have summarized them in their ideal form. These are the principles that were established at the birth of our nation, and we must understand how they are intended to work. The extent to which our government works well is the extent to which it confines its activities to the spirit and scope of the Constitution. Here is a hard fact that all Americans should bear in mind. With but scant exception, every major national problem would disappear from the face of our land if government at every level were to get back inside the boundaries of the United States Constitution. Every major national problem. Political, legal, and scientific experts of every bent have tried to tackle America's social and political problems by adding more laws, inventing new programs, spending more money, extending more credit, regulating more affairs, and making more intrusions into our private lives. But rarely do we hear of any serious proposals for reducing the size and cost of government and getting it back under the Constitution. During recent years, a few proposals have been made which at first glance seem to offer some kind of relief for taxpayers and freedom-loving citizens. These propositions are known as a balanced budget amendment, federalism reform, or in other words, a conference of the states, and a term limits amendment. All three of these proposals imply that our national problems are caused by a defective or incomplete Constitution. At first glance, they seem to be conservative answers to major national problems. Their proponents say they offer at least a first step in the direction of limited government. But inclusive with all three of these movements is an ultimate plan to amend the Constitution by a process never used since 1787. That process is known as a constitutional convention. Amendments to balance the budget and to limit congressional terms are aimed at calling a new convention, while the Conference of the States purports to seek fundamental structural reform without following the formal route established in the Constitution under Article 5. There are two ways to amend the Constitution, and there are two ways to get a new amendment ratified. The procedures are set forth in Article 5 of the Constitution. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as a part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress. Amendments may originate in Congress or in a convention called by the states, and they may be ratified either by the state legislatures or by special state ratifying conventions. Why? Why in over 200 years has no federal convention ever been held? It is a perfectly legal process. It is in the Constitution, and obviously our founding fathers intended for the states to use it, especially if Congress refused to act on amendments wanted by the people. What then is the problem? The problem is simply this. Since the founding of our nation, no convention has ever been held because no one has ever figured out how to control one. A convention has far more power than merely to amend. It is the process by which a free people create government. In our society, the people are the highest sovereign power and may appoint delegates to exercise it on their behalf. They can create a government, write a constitution, rewrite a constitution, amend it or abolish it, and should they decide to exceed their mandate, there is no power on earth to stop them. Those individuals and organizations who now clamor for a modern-day constitutional convention insist that it would be limited and controlled by three factors. They offer assurances that, number one, the wording of the state applications will limit the purpose and scope of the convention. Number two, the process established under Article 5 will be followed. Number three, a convention can only propose amendments which are not final until ratified by 3/4 of the states. Let us consider these claims one at a time, starting with the wording of the state applications. Before the assembly of a convention, Article 5 allows the states one thing and one thing only, to apply for a convention. Notice that there is no provision in Article 5 for a state to give a reason or specify the subject matter of the convention or to propose a specific amendment. A convention is an assembly of delegates appointed to work out their mutual needs, and by its nature a convention is a deliberative body. If the states were to bring to the convention something drafted elsewhere, then the convention would merely be a part of the ratification process. A convention is not called to ratify, it is called to deliberate. This understanding is supported by the fact that all applications made by the states during the first 100 years of this nation were for a general convention. Not one state ever attempted to limit the convention to a particular subject or to a specific amendment. Contrary to what we're now being told, there is no such thing as a limited convention, regardless of the purpose for which it might be called. Now let us consider their second point, that the process established in Article 5 will be followed. Nobody can make that promise at all. Article 5 will be just as susceptible to change as would any other article under consideration in a new convention. If a convention has the power to amend Article 1 or Article 2 or any other part of the Constitution, then once the convention opens, every word of Article 5 would be up for grabs. Article 5 may well be followed to get the convention started, but if the new rules of procedure are made, they become effective during the convention. That is precisely what happened in 1787 when the convention changed the ratification process established in the Articles of Confederation under which the convention met. It required all changes to be ratified by all 13 of the states. The convention changed it to 9. A new convention could also change the rules, and therefore there could be nothing sacred about Article 5 once the convention gets underway. The third point made by the convention crowd is that nothing can go wrong because the state legislatures must ratify all amendments that come out of a convention. Let's take a look at the way this point is emphasized in a videotape produced by U.S. Term Limits Foundation.
Legal scholars argue back and forth about whether you can limit what proposals come out of a convention. But the important thing to remember is that the convention, as set up by the Founding Fathers, can only propose amendments. It cannot enact amendments. And therefore, the real check that we have is that 38 states, 3/4 of the states, both chambers of their legislature have to ratify any amendment before it becomes part of the Constitution.
The idea that a convention can only propose amendments would be absolutely correct if conventions were not sovereign assemblies. Fortunately, the first convention in 1787 exercised its inherent power to create the greatest nation on earth. But unfortunately, that same power, misused today, could do great harm in a new convention now planned for the year 2000 by the leading term limits organization. American historian Richard B. Morris reports on the only precedent we have in the exercise of convention power and the manner in which our founding fathers circumvented the rules of ratification. He writes, "The convention had overstepped its instructions. It had scrapped the Articles of Confederation instead of amending them. Having defied Congress, the convention decided to pursue what amounted to a revolutionary course by declaring the ratification by 9 states sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states so ratifying the same. In other words, the Constitution was being submitted directly to the people through ratifying conventions. Not even Congress, which had summoned the convention, would be asked to approve its work." And Morris goes on to say that the convention shrewdly bypassed the state legislatures, attached as they were to states' rights, and which required in most cases the agreement of 2 houses. If speedy ratification was a reasonable objective, then the single-chambered, specially elected state ratifying conventions, rather than the state legislatures, seemed to hold the greatest prospect for agreement. The state ratifying conventions provided the only chance for keeping the new Constitution alive and getting it adopted. And if you think that process was used only in 1787, it may surprise you to know that it was used again in 1933 when it came time to ratify the 21st Amendment, which called for the repeal of prohibition. Congress again bypassed the state legislatures because they opposed repeal. Congress was determined to get it ratified, so Congress established rules for the selection of delegates in the states to form ratifying conventions. Legislators in Utah, one of the dry states, had vowed not to approve the amendment, but delegates favorable to passage were elected, and they approved the amendment, making Utah the 36th state, the number then needed to legalize the sale of liquor nationwide. Again, they shrewdly bypassed the legislatures in the ratifying process because they knew they would never get it passed in the State House. Many state legislators who have been induced to vote for a convention have also been assured that they will have the chance to block any bad amendments that come back to them during the ratification process. But one thing is certain. If a convention produces anything not likely to be approved by the legislatures, the opportunity to kill it in the ratifying process will never come. The states can call a convention, but it's like launching a rocket and handing the guidance controls to someone else. They cannot control its course or determine where it will land. The current effort to limit the terms of elected officials is one of the most dangerous and deceitful movements to appear on the American scene. Its beginnings appear to be innocent enough. But in 1994, the term limits movement was taken over by the Cato Institute and reorganized under the name U.S. Term Limits. We know that Cato scholars are aware of the dangers of a convention because we have the records of their meetings on that subject. They seem willing to disregard historical facts that contradict their claims, and they have taken advantage of the information gap found among the majority of our people. The term limit organizers promote the false notion that the amount of time spent in public office is at the root of most national problems. But the problem is not tenure in public office. The problem is excessive government. Nearly all members of Congress support measures that exceed the limits of their office, not after 20 years, but on their first day and in their first session in Congress. Time has nothing to do with it. The major crisis in America is excessive government in Washington and sleeping voters at home. Our founding fathers gave us true term limits by way of our freedom to vote. Term limits groups fight only a symptom, re-elected socialists in Congress. But the cause of the problem is not in Congress, it is in the voting booth. It is caused by people who do not understand the Constitution or who fail to follow the voting records of their men and women in Congress. Term limits cannot limit the growth and power of government. The newly elected and the veterans will continue to exceed their mandate if we, the people, permit them to do so. America's problems can never be solved if we treat only the symptoms. We must continue to build greater understanding among the voting public. Term limits advocates make the ridiculous claim that our founding fathers established a citizen legislature, not to be run by career politicians in a permanent Congress. This notion is dramatized in another segment of the video produced by U.S. Term Limits Foundation.
They met more than 200 years ago and established an ideal of citizen government. People would take temporary leave from their jobs and families to serve their neighbors in a citizen legislature. Recently, something has gone terribly wrong. Far from a citizen legislature, we have career politicians in a permanent Congress.
Nice job, but totally false. America's founders were deeply concerned with the lack of experience and skill in the management of legislative affairs. The convention records of 1787 are replete with expressions of their desire to establish permanency in government and build stability in our domestic and foreign affairs. James Madison argued earnestly for experience in office and for frequent re-elections. Here is what he said: "A few members of Congress, as happens in all such assemblies, will possess superior talents, will by frequent re-elections become members of long standing, will be thoroughly masters of the public business, and perhaps not unwilling to avail themselves of those advantages. The greater the proportion of new members, and the less the information of the bulk of the members, the more apt they will be to fall into the snares that have been laid for them." Alexander Hamilton argued at length against term limits, and in the Federalist Papers he is on record with an insight that might well have been written today. Of term limits he said, "Nothing appears more plausible at first sight, nor more ill-founded upon close inspection." Connecticut's deputy at the convention of 1787, Roger Sherman, said, "Frequent elections are necessary to preserve the good behavior of rulers. They also tend to give permanency to the government by preserving that good behavior because it ensures their re-election." Our founding fathers were themselves the most tenured, most experienced, most professional men on the American continent. Most of them spent their entire lives in public service and were of inestimable value in the laying of the foundation of our republic. They had had experience drafting constitutions for their own states, had served as state legislators, as governors, as members of the Continental Congress, and as delegates to the Convention of 1787. It is ridiculous to say that they were citizen legislators, except perhaps in the context of being citizens of the states they represented, or in meeting the citizenship qualifications for their office. U.S. term limits, by their definition, would regard Washington, Hamilton, and Madison as career politicians. They served a combined total of 88 years in public service. Let's take one more look at U.S. term limits video and consider its fallacious view of the constitutional role of Congress.
In fact, a convention would have no more power than Congress exercises. Both can only propose amendments.
The assertion that a convention can do nothing that Congress can't do is preposterous. Can Congress create government? Obviously not. Congress is the creation of a convention, not its creator. Members of Congress are at all times under oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. But it is significant that under Article 6, delegates to the convention are not required to take such an oath. How could convention delegates swear to uphold a constitution that they have been appointed to alter? Statements such as those made by U.S. term limits are typical of the nonsense being propagated to allay the well-founded fears of informed citizens and of the great majority of our nation's legal scholars. Former Chief Justice of the United States, Warren Burger, has written, "I have also repeatedly given my opinion that there is no effective way to muzzle the actions of a constitutional convention. The convention could make its own rules and set its own agenda. After a convention is convened, it will be too late to stop the convention if we don't like its agenda." Former Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg has written, "The most serious problem Article 5 poses is a runaway convention. There is no enforceable mechanism to prevent a convention from reporting out wholesale changes in our Constitution and Bill of Rights." Perhaps one of the most respected authorities on this subject is Stanford University's Gerald Gunther. In response to those who scoff at the likelihood of a runaway convention, Professor Gunther has written, "The fear that a constitutional convention could become a runaway convention and propose wholesale changes in our Constitution is by no means unfounded. Rather, this broad view of the authority of a convention reflects the consensus of most constitutional scholars who have commented on the issue." Then he adds this note, "I have developed lengthy arguments, legal and practical, that support the case that there is no effective way to limit the agenda of a convention, as have many other scholars." Yes, many other scholars. Here are the letters and statements of most authorities on the subject. This letter from Notre Dame Law School insists that there is no way to limit the scope of a convention. In this letter from Brigham Young University, the president of the college, Rex E. Lee, says that as it happened in 1787, it could happen again today, that there would be no way to prevent them from drifting into forays beyond the scope of the convention. Harvard University scholar Lawrence Tribe has written warnings on the subject. Warnings come from the University of Maryland Law School and from Southern Methodist Law School, as well as from the justices of the Supreme Court. Notwithstanding these clear warnings, convention advocates press on fervently with their campaign. It's almost as if they were in a hurry to get a convention underway before enough people are awakened to the danger. The term limits movement got off to a successful start in Colorado, California, and Oklahoma. These states have one thing in common: the voter initiative. This is a process by which legislation is proposed by petition and then placed on the ballot at general election time for voters to decide by voting yes or no. Only 24 states allow this process. The ballot initiative is the easiest way to get broad public support on almost anything if enough money can be found to promote the issue and pay the petitioners. Polls indicate that the American people do not take time to study current problems. They know little about their Constitution and their history, and they can be misled easily on the merits of most any public issue. Riding high on the easy sell term limits byword, U.S. term limits paid petitioners to get 5 million Americans to sign their names on petitions to place term limits on state ballots. By 1994, term limits initiatives had passed in 23 of the states that use the initiative process. It is important to note that these measures limited the terms of both state and federal officials. Passage of these initiatives amounted to a phenomenal success for the term limit organizers. The ballot measures passed by as much as 70% in many of the targeted states. But the really big push came after Congress refused to limit its own terms and the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the state-imposed limits on congressional terms. Those circumstances were made to order for anyone desiring a constitutional convention more than simply an amendment. In 1993, 2 years before the Supreme Court handed down its ruling, the Cato Institute hosted a conference at which Lloyd N. Cutler made a persuasive case against the constitutionality of state-imposed term limits for Congress. He insisted that adding a new qualification for candidates for Congress would require an amendment to the United States Constitution. Apparently aware of the need for an amendment, the Cato-created U.S. term limits went ahead anyway, even financing an estimated 88% of the 1994 petition campaigns that got term limits for Congress on ballots in 23 states. Why? Is it possible that the term limits backers fully expected the Supreme Court to strike down those state laws that had just gotten passed? Were they creating the pretext for saying, we have no choice? the court has forced the people to call an Article 5 convention for term limits. Rejection by the court and refusal of Congress to introduce an amendment have been used as the unavoidable reasons for calling a convention. But if it happens that a convention is wanted more than simply an amendment, such a plot would be spoiled if Congress were to cave in and pass a term limits amendment. Now that possibility would certainly let all the steam out of the convention pressure kettle. But no worry, U.S. term limits took care of that possibility far in advance of the High Court's ruling. They have done everything in their power to guarantee that Congress will not beat them to the punch and defuse the convention trap. How has this been done? By tightening the screws on the House of Representatives. They have set a rule of 3 terms in the House for a total limit of 6 years. Early on, most members of Congress had been amenable to 12-year limits. But now, under the Cato-imposed 6-year limits, it will be impossible to muster a 2/3 vote in the House. That sort of guaranteed that no Congress would upset the plan for a modern-day constitutional convention. The stage has now been set. They had a pretext for public outrage against Congress, the perception that term limits would avenge the voters, an accommodating Supreme Court seeming to slam dunk the will of the public, and the semblance of a self-serving Congress refusing to budge on limiting its own terms. In 1996, they launched petition campaigns to get initiatives on ballots in 14 of the states that allow the initiative process. Complicated, hard-to-read petitions of 3 and 4 pages in length were custom crafted to fit the needs of each state. As might be expected, nearly everyone signed them and nobody read them. Professional petitioners assured the people simply that their signatures would limit terms in Congress. Nearly every person signing a 1996 petition thought it was merely a term limits initiative. Most signers did not know that they were calling for a constitutional convention, and clearly many had not the slightest understanding of the magnitude or implications of such a rash proposition. These were no ordinary initiatives. They contained punishments for legislators refusing to call a convention. Reluctant lawmakers were coerced into making the call by the threat of statements printed on their re-election ballots accusing them of disregarding voter instructions on term limits. Slightly dishonest, yes. Many legislators have refused to call a convention because under today's conditions, they feel that they cannot so endanger the Constitution without violating their oaths of office to defend and protect it. Now that is a real catch-22 in anyone's book. But thanks to a number of alert citizens, many from the John Birch Society, opposition to this sleight-of-hand avenue to a convention was quickly mounted. My article, Limit Government, Not Terms, was widely distributed, and a powerful, more comprehensive piece was written by attorney George Detweiler for the New American Magazine. A reprint of his article, Term Limits Temptation, was mailed to all 7,400 of our nation's state legislators and to many newspaper editors. The unconstitutional effort to bias a candidate on the ballot, the contrived route to a convention, the total absence of public debate or deliberation on the magnitude of such an event, and abuses of the initiative process were brought to the attention of the public, state officials, attorneys general, and the courts. When many voters in the state of Washington and in Missouri realized they had signed petitions for a constitutional convention, they were upset and asked to have their names removed. Letters to editors generated a surge of editorials in opposition to the convention calls, and many newspapers took a formal position against the ballot measures. A new awareness began to take root, and courts in 2 states, Arkansas and Oklahoma, removed the initiatives from their ballots. A Missouri court removed the convention call part and left intact the term limits part of a 2-part initiative. In Idaho, the Attorney General declared the initiative unconstitutional, and it faces a court challenge in that state. The South Dakota ballot measure contained no convention call. By November 5th, 1996, only 11 convention calls remained on state ballots, and only 6 of them were approved by the voters, and these by very small margins. Voters in 5 states rejected the term limits calls outright. Those states are Montana, North Dakota, Oregon, Washington, and Wyoming. This was a great upset to the slick, professional, well-funded constitutional convention drive conducted in the name of term limits, and it was a significant victory for freedom and common sense. Opinion polls taken prior to the November 1996 general election favored the term limits measures by 70 to 74%. However, the real poll taken in the voting booths averaged only 53.9%, still favoring this term limits nonsense. The struggle to protect the Constitution of the United States is far from over. Term limit lobbyists are now pressuring the non-initiative states to adopt the voter initiative system, obviously the easy way to feign quick popular support. They're trying to recover their losses and start new drives in the remaining initiative states for the 1998 general election ballots. This dangerous and deceitful effort must be stopped. Every person viewing this program can do something to help us keep the Constitution out of the ravages of a new convention. We must keep it out of the hands of those powerful individuals who advocate a convention for any seemingly just cause. The Constitution does not need amending. It only needs to be obeyed. There is much more to this issue than time permits in this particular program, but more information is available, and we urge you to call the 800 number shown at the end of this program and ask for the ConCon packet.